to modernise its decision-making, to enable much more rapid deployment of troops and planes across NATO's internal border, and above all, to beef up its strategic communications, which are so often much less than the sum of their parts. We need a faster and more coherent response from NATO. Third, whether we are Remainers or Brexiteers in this House, we do need to come together now to support the security partnership that the Prime Minister described so well in her Munich speech. And one obvious way to reinforce the security of what continues to be our continent is to help reduce Europe's dependence on Russian gas. And that means, even as we leave the European Union, supporting the fledgling European energy market, and I was delighted to see that reference in the Prime Minister's earlier Mansion House speech. It means helping to increase diversity of supply across our continent, encouraging dual flows and shared coding, promoting more interconnection, and using our technology and our regulatory experience to continue to play a leading part in making the European energy market much more resilient. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need here to continue to strengthen our defences. Yes, the Prime Minister was right to remind the House that we have a rising defence budget since April 2016. Yes, we do meet the 2% target. But Russia is not spending 2% of its GDP on defence. It's spending over 5% of its GDP on defence. Of course.
Does the former Secretary of State for Defence consider that spending 2% of our GDP on defence is not enough?
That is precisely the point I'm now about to address. Russia is spending 5% on conventional weapons, on nuclear weapons, on cyber, on hybrid, and we now know on a completely illegal chemical weapons programme. Now, the NATO 2%, as my right honourable friend has pointed out, of course, is a minimum and not a ceiling. And I think the House should consider this, and I make this point in not a party political way at all. In the last year of the last century, the Blair government was spending 2.7%. That was before 9/11. That was before Daesh terrorism. It was before Kim had his nuclear weapons. It was before cyber attacks on our own parliament, and it was before Russia became more malignant again. And I don't recall anybody, and I was in the House in 1999, suggesting that our armed forces were overfunded then. So if we want to continue to lead in NATO, on the ground in the Baltics, on the air over the Black Sea, in the North Sea, in the North Atlantic, in anti-submarine warfare, if we want to go on playing our part in the counter-Daesh coalition, if we want to also prop up fragile democracies in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, in Nigeria, if we want to go on contributing to United Nations peacekeeping in sub-Saharan Africa, if we want to maintain a presence in the Gulf and recommit to protect international trade routes in Asia-Pacific, then we have to will the means to do so. And that means, along with the modernisation programme that I know my right honourable friends are now considering, we do now have to set our minds, and this is the answer to my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, we do now have to set our mind to a higher defence target. And I have said publicly that I think we should be committing under the next spending review to meeting at least 2.5% of GDP by the end of this Parliament. If there is one thing that Salisbury has taught us all over again, is that what Russia really understands is weakness. Countries that won't stand up for themselves, won't protect their people, won't protect their values and the freedoms that they enjoy. We've never been such a country. Salisbury should remind us all that we never should be.
Yeah, very nice.
Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I warmly commend everything that the Right Honourable Member for Sevenoaks has just said, not least his final point in regard to Russia only respecting strength. I think you could make that a bit more personal, in all honesty. I think President Putin only respects strength. And indeed, when President Obama tried to press the reset button with Russia, he got absolutely nothing out of it because President Putin simply took everything he'd got and gave nothing back. And now we see that President Putin seems to be committed to some kind of arms race with the West as well, and indeed announced that just before he calls it a general election, but it's not really a general election in the way that any of us would know. I think we need to set all of this debate in the context of everything else that is true about Putin's Russia now. It's the human rights abuses which are endless. The murder of so many journalists in particular I find deeply offensive, especially when there have been absolutely no attempt to try and pursue those who were responsible. The most famous name is Anna Politkovskaya, but there are many, many others as well. The repeated use of excessive force, whether it's in response to the Beslan siege in the school, or the Moscow theatre siege, or in response to other abuses in Chechnya and political dissidents in Chechnya, Putin's immediate response is excessive violence. And I think that's what we've seen on the streets of Salisbury as well. It's the rigged elections. I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman for Cheltenham.
Gentlemen agree with me that it's not just excessive violence, but it's also excessive dishonesty. And that when we saw the invasion of Ukraine, the instinctive response of the Russian regime was to lie about it, just as they did about MH17. And that is a particular concern.
That's absolutely right. But what angered me more than anything else, in a sense, in relation to Ukraine, was that the whole point of the Budapest Accord was that all those who signed up to it, including Russia and the United Kingdom, were guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Ukraine so that Ukraine would surrender its nuclear weapons. And I suspect that if that hadn't happened, then Putin wouldn't subsequently have gone into Ukraine. And that's precisely the kind of long-term, deliberate pattern of lying and territorial ambition, which I think is characteristic of the man. Let alone the murder of political opponents like Boris Nemtsov, the trials that are in so many instances don't even attempt to pretend to be fair. Yep. I went to Mikhail Khodorkovsky's second trial, but I mean, in addition to which was quite clearly being run by a martinet of a judge who was simply taking orders directly from the Kremlin, but most extraordinarily, the criminal justice system has been used in Russia now to prosecute Sergei Magnitsky after he's dead. I mean, if they couldn't, I mean, it's sometimes I think they want to believe that they're in a satire because that's a means of sort of cooking a snook to the rest of the world, just to point out how much centralised power the Putin regime has. But even more disturbing in a sense for those who care about Russia and her people is the state of the economy. So many people, public sector workers, have had dramatic cuts to their salaries and their pensions in recent years. The average wage has fallen, and the death rate has, people are dying younger now than they used to. That's an extraordinary phenomenon in a modern economy, and an economy which was proclaimed some 10 years ago as going to be one of the BRIC economies that was going to be the future of the world, growing and all the rest of it, now stagnating because it is, to all intents and purposes, a monogorod. That is to say, an economy that is based on a single industry, namely petrocarbons. It's languishing at 1.2%. Now, we may be only having growth of 1.2%, but for an economy at that level in the world, they need to be on 5, 6, 7 and 8% if they're not going to completely stagnate as a country and people aren't going to see gross inequalities get worse. What they should have done for the last 10 years is build on their phenomenal human capital, because it's one of the most educated countries in the world, and tackle the corruption. Unfortunately, what they've done is they've built on the corruption and tackle the education. So now you see a massive brain drain of clever Russians leaving that country for elsewhere, and they've fallen further down the transparency list of countries around the world with increasing corruption. And one of the things that I find personally the most bizarre element elements of the whole Putin charade is his personal and his regime's utter obsession with homosexuality. And for a man who seems to like taking his shirt off more than any other political leader, this does strike me as phenomenally bizarre. I gather he also likes ABBA. What can I say? Madam Deputy Speaker, what should the British response be to this present situation? And not only to this present situation, but actually everything that we've seen over recent years, because this is part of a pattern and should be seen as such. Some say we should tackle the money that is swashing around in Britain, the Russian money, much of which may be dirty. Some say we should adopt a more robust political and defence posture. Personally, I think we need to do both. And I know that there are some who are reluctant to tackle the financial issues and there are some who are reluctant to tackle the defence issues, but I think we have to do the two in harmony, which is in essence, I think, what the Right Honourable Member for Sevenoaks was saying earlier. Oh, yes, of course.
The defence side of what can be done. Would he back calls from myself, my honourable friend from Western Bartonshire, that we should ask our allies to stop allowing the Russian fleet to refuel in their ports?
Hear, hear. Yes, indeed. One of the first things I did when I knew about the incident in Salisbury was I checked with the Spanish ambassador whether Spain is maintaining its posture of refusing to allow Russian boats to refuel in Ceuta, and indeed they are. They've been very strong on this, and they are absolutely resolute with us, as they have been for the last 10 years. So, if I might just deal with some of the financial aspects, I've already referred earlier in the debate when I spoke with when I asked the Prime Minister about the Tier 1 investor visa. I think this has, to all intents and purposes, acted as a kind of magnet for some Russians who want to place their money beyond the grasping hands of others in Russia or in other domains in the United Kingdom. And there have hardly been any questions asked. And I really hope that the government will now do a full review of the Tier 1 investor visa. Secondly, it is true that trusts in this country and in the dependent territories are used as a means of obscuring from public view the real owners of major assets, including land and property. And I think that needs to end. I'm happy for the trust system to remain because I think in many ways it's a strong element of our financial system. But it needs to be fully transparent because otherwise it is far too easy for Russians to hide their money. And I just hope that the government will review this matter. It has been asked time and time again whether it will consider making the beneficial ownership of trusts a public register rather than one that is only available to the authorities. And I say that would be valuable because the public and the journalists in this country have done a phenomenal job in recent years in managing to winkle out additional financial information that others might not choose to bother looking at. We also need to bring in full financial transparency in the overseas territories. I know the Minister who's going to be closing agrees with this policy. I just hope that this might be an opportunity to be able to rather twist their arms a little bit further up their backs, because otherwise it's too easy for somebody like Mr. Deripaska to buy a property in London, only not really buy it via a trust based in the British Virgin Islands and have it completely obscured from view. And it's an interesting fact, some of us who were taken on the kleptocracy tour of last week, including the Honourable Member for Durham, who's sitting, for Bishop Auckland, sorry, who's sitting on the front bench, will know that one of the interesting facts is that quite often Russians are now buying houses deliberately in the UK for grossly inflated prices as a means of laundering their money via a third party. And I very much hope that the authorities are investigating that. I just want to move on to some of the other elements, the more defence-related elements that I think we need to address. Firstly, we need to have properly sceptical investigation by the police and all the authorities, if necessary the counter-terrorism authorities as well, of the 14 deaths of Russians that have happened in the last few years, which have been suspicious, and not just those in the last couple of weeks. It seems unlikely that anybody would choose not to investigate, but it still seems possible that that may be what has happened. We also need a full spectrum readiness, more counterintelligence and more cyber security. And I think we also have to stand very strong with our NATO allies. And as the Right Honourable Member Sevenoaks said, I think we need to devote more than 2% of our national income to defence. We can see this through, but it's only by being robust and firm and steady state rather than flip-flopping, that we will do so.
Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Near the end of the Second World War, the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee of the British Chiefs of Staff, as it was then, produced a report entitled Relations with the Russians. From years of experience working with them against the Nazis, the JIC concluded that Russia would respect only strength as the basis for any future relationship. This mirrored Lord Palmerston's view almost a century earlier that, and I quote, "The policy and practice of the Russian government has always been to push forward its encroachments as fast and as far as the apathy or want of firmness of other governments would allow it to go, but always to stop and retire when it met with decided resistance and then to wait for the next favourable opportunity." Not much has changed. Alexander Litvinenko died in London on the 23rd of November 2006. 4 days later, the BBC News website published an article headed "Russia Law on Killing Extremists," in inverted commas, abroad. It's worth quoting this for the record. A new Russian law adopted earlier in the year formally permits the extrajudicial killings abroad of those Moscow accuses of extremism. In July, the upper chamber of the Russian Parliament, the Federation Council, approved a law which permits the Russian president to use the country's armed forces and special services outside Russia's borders to combat terrorism and extremism. At the same time, amendments to several other laws governing the security services, mass media and communications were adopted. The overall result was to dramatically expand those defined as terrorist or extremist. Along with those seeking to overthrow the Russian government, the term is also applied to, quotes again, those causing mass disturbances, committing hooliganism or acts of vandalism. Much more controversially, the law also defines, quotes, those slandering the individual occupying the post of President of the Russian Federation. So if you insult the President of Russia, you can legally be killed overseas according to this law. The Russian law is very specific, the BBC report concluded, in that it permits the President, alone and apparently without consultation, to take such a decision. So I have to say that at least one honourable member will not be on Vladimir Putin's Christmas card list after his speech today. If anyone had doubts about Russia's responsibility for the Salisbury poisonings, her contemptuous failure to respond to the Prime Minister's 24-hour deadline should swiftly have dispelled them. An innocent regime would have rushed to explain how a nerve agent, which only it produced, could have been acquired and employed by anybody else. We should also have been spared sarcastic suggestions in the Russian media that the United Kingdom is, quote, an unsafe place for traitors to settle, as well as the ludicrous claim that we ourselves were behind the attack. That was a charge straight from the playbook of those who blame the Jews for 9/11 and US intelligence for the Kennedy assassination. Vladimir Putin is a product of the KGB. Schooled in the suppression of captive countries, steeped in the culture of communist domination, and filled with regret that the Soviet empire imploded. According to him, its breakup was the greatest disaster of the 20th century, a revealing and curious choice when compared with the millions killed in 2 world wars, in the Russian Civil War, in the forced collectivizations, the mass deportations, and the hell of the Gulag. Until the Bolshevik Revolution, there was some chance of Russia evolving along democratic lines. Then the cancer of Marxism-Leninism gave psychopaths and dictators their ideological excuse to seize total control. Their opponents were denounced as enemies of the people and put or worked to death with no semblance of due process. Now that the ideology has gone, the ruthless mindset remains. Russian leaders no longer claim to be building a workers' paradise, but they still believe that Western capitalists will sell them the rope with which to be hanged. For 40 years from 1949, 2 factors ensured the containment of Russia and the maintenance of peace. One was the deterrent power of Western nuclear weapons, the other was the collective security provided by Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. No longer could an aggressor attack small European states without the Americans immediately entering the war. Yet such preparedness did not come cheaply. In the early 1960s, UK defence spending accounted for 6% of our GDP, the same percentage as welfare. The current welfare budget is 6 times the size of the defence budget. In the mid-1980s, defence constituted 5% of our GDP, the same percentage as education and health. The current education and health budgets are respectively 2.5 and 4 times the size of the defence budget. In the changed strategic situation, this downgrading of defence cannot be allowed to continue. Since 2016, the Defence Committee has been making the case for a defence budget target of 3% of GDP, which is what it used to be in the mid-1990s, even after the cuts following the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the end of the Cold War. The former Defence Secretary has called, and has called again today, for a 2.5% target by the end of this parliamentary term. His successor is squaring up for a battle with the Treasury. It's a fight which has to be won for the safety of us all and for the security of our country.
Well, honourable friend, allow me.
I will.
Does the chairman of the Defence Select Committee think that the way to defeat a modern Russia is the way we defeated the USSR? Reagan crashed their economy because, in effect, there was an arms race between a strong and vibrant American economy and a weak Russian economy. Is that a way forward, does he think?
I would certainly say that it's part of a way forward, and I will use the generous extra minute that I've been given to say that I'm a little concerned about the fact that whilst the government is quite right to recognise that there are new threats as well, there are cyber threats, there are digital threats, and there are intensified propaganda threats, including through the abuse of social media, whilst that is all true, and whilst that all requires us to devote new resources to meet those new threats, that doesn't mean that the old threats and the old remedies to the old threats have gone away. And I don't like this conflation of national security budgets with defence budgets, because that means that if you add more to the national security budget, you are going to take more away from the defence budget unless you listen to the warnings of the former Defence Secretary, amongst others, that 2% of spending of GDP spending on defence is not enough. But finally, I cannot resist, in the last few seconds, appealing to the Foreign Secretary, who I'm pleased to see back on the front bench to hear my speech, of appealing to him once again to save the BBC monitoring service at Caversham, which we are supposed to have been going to visit, which costs £25 million a year to keep going, which is going to be decimated and absorbed into a wider system which will not be as effective as the dedicated teams that exist at Caversham, because if it was true before that we needed to save it, after all that's happened in recent days, it's even more true now.
Order now. Speaking of generous extra minutes, I'm afraid that after the next speaker, I'll be reducing the time limit to 7 minutes. Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was glad that the Prime Minister started the debate by making sure that it was articulated that the argument of this Parliament was not with the Russian nation or the diversity of its peoples. Because I'm sure the Foreign Secretary will forgive me. Some of the comments from the front bench at the weekend were unnecessary, I think, in trying to promote dialogue at an extremely difficult time. I think it's important that we must acknowledge, while there is still no definitive proof that the Salisbury attack was carried out by the Russian regime, that there has been no admission of any culpability, nor are we actually likely to receive any. There is no doubt in my mind that it fits a clear pattern of behaviour and threat escalation, not only here in the UK, but in a host of other European states as well, particularly those in the post-Soviet periphery. This is most worrying, especially in the broader geostrategic context, as it's actually coincided with the defence industry modernisation programme in the Russian Federation, which has led many, myself included, to fear that we could be about to enter into a new and unwelcome arms race in Europe, which is in no one's interest. Let us not forget that the first call he had with Vladimir Putin after his inauguration, the new president, or the present president of the United States, called the New START treaty, due to last until 2021, as one of the worst deals signed by the Obama administration, that it favoured Russia. Let's be clear. If New START falls, a whole host of other arms control treaties and agreements begin to unravel. Now, this is, of course, a treaty between, Madam Deputy Speaker, the United States and the Russian Federation, but the consequences of our own security are immense. Yet the evidence would suggest that the UK is in a period of unprecedented weakness in terms of its ability to understand and interpret Russian strategy. Madam Deputy Speaker, whether we like it or not, understanding Russia and its motivations is a fundamental duty of any administration. Yet I would contend that successive governments have made a strategic decision to dismantle infrastructure, to disinvest from skills and people, and to divert funds that have previously been allocated through the FCO, the intelligence services and the Ministry of Defence, which had allowed these agencies to understand the Russian Federation and the old Soviet Union, and help the government to make informed decisions on its policy. I will give one example of how this capability has been systematically dismantled. The Soviet Studies Research Centre was Sandhurst's in-house think tank into Russian military policy. It became the Conflict Studies Research Centre in 1992, but was then moved to the Tri-Service capability and moved to Shrivenham with the resultant loss of capacity in 2005. It then became the Advanced Research and Assessment branch in 2007. Before it was folded finally in 2010. All that remains from the Army's in-house capability, with its 40-odd years of institutional knowledge, is the Russian Military Studies Archive, still based at Shrivenham, which is struggling itself for long-term funding. Now, with the timeline in mind, let's run over the major milestones in Russian... I will, to the honourable gentleman.
Just on that point, there is one gentleman who mans that centre, one Russian speaker, who comes down from Scotland. I see him occasionally. He is still going through the archives, and effectively it is nothing more than a glorified library, which is hugely understaffed, and I think it is a great shame, and I agree with him, that ARAG was unfortunately done away with only a couple of years after. It's one of the most useful reports into the Georgian War. Thank you.
Gentleman for his intervention. I highlight some of the issues that it faces in terms of knowledge of the Russian Federation, and I also hope to be meeting that gentleman very soon myself. But we'll go back to the timeline of the Russian Federation. The last decade or so, the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, Putin's return to power in 2012, the annexation of Crimea in 2014. I cannot help but come to the conclusion that as the need to understand Russia's increasing assertiveness has increased, consecutive governments of every colour have decreased the UK's capability and ability to get to grips with it.
Hear, hear.
Quite simply, the UK's inability to meet the upcoming strategic challenges which Russia poses, the Russian government poses, should cause us all concern. And as we begin to contemplate a new era of increasing turbulence in global arms control, and the prospect of a new arms race looms, frankly, we should all be scared. In this context, the multiple examples of Russian donations to political parties in the UK seem particularly misjudged, and I would hope that we would consider returning them. The ill-gotten gains and the stolen wealth of the Russian people has flowed through this city for far too long. It has entered into the bloodstream of politics. It has purchased property and greased the wheels of the financial sector. That this has happened at the same time that governments have run down its understanding of Russia is not only complacent, it must finally be seen as an abdication for responsibility. We must begin preparations, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the post-Putin era. But who are the potential successors? It is likely that they will be a generation who did not know the Soviet Union, like Putin did. They will probably not come with the KGB baggage he did. It will be a huge potential opening with the possibility of not repeating past mistakes made by both sides, which have led us to this profound point. This type of thinking cannot be done on the cheap, and I fear a diplomatic service consumed by the difficulties of Brexit, that's me being diplomatic, we will be unable to find the resources to do it. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me end by saying that this horrific attack on the UK, carried out against Sergei and Yulia Skripal, may be a new low in our relations with the Russian Federation government. But we must both push back firmly, as the Prime Minister has indicated, and also use it as a wake-up call. The potential for future misunderstanding and miscalculation is great. Let us not use this violence in vain.
Hear, hear, hear.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to be called in this debate, which is well timed following the appalling and outrageous events in Salisbury barely 3 weeks ago. The question must now be asked, does Russia pose a threat to the national security of the United Kingdom and its allies? I believe that it does, and that we are now entering a new period of Anglo-Russian relations which, if not quite a Cold War, as we had in the last century, is at least what I would call a cool war, characterised by the aggressive actions of a Putin-led government in Moscow and our strained relations with that government as a result. Assessing a threat classically involves an examination of both capabilities and intentions, so perhaps we should best begin by taking a look at the development of Russian military capabilities in recent years. President Putin's rather bellicose State of the Union address just prior to his re-election contained references to new ultra-long-range nuclear cruise missiles, some of them launched by submarine or even underwater drones, he claimed, and thus capable of evading America's limited ballistic missile defences. Analysts currently differ about the existence of such weapons. However, we do know that the Russians have already developed a long-range nuclear-capable cruise missile, the KH-101, which is already being fitted to strategic bomber aircraft of Russian long-range aviation. In addition, the Russian strategic rocket forces deploy around 1,200 warheads in silo-based and road-mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Russians have an active modernisation programme underway for their strategic nuclear forces, which aims to replace all of the old Soviet-era ICBMs by 2020, with many of the new missiles having multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles or MIRVed warheads. Russia's strategic triad is completed by its ballistic missile submarines, or SSBNs, including 3 new vessels of the Dolgoruki class, armed with the new SSN-32 ballistic missile. All the Russian SLBMs can reach their targets from their home ports, and those in the Northern Fleet are more than capable of reaching the United Kingdom. In recent years, Russia has also made considerable strides in quieting its submarines, especially the new class of sever-advanced nuclear attack submarines, which are now entering service. In addition, many of Russia's submarines are now armed with a Caliber land attack cruise missile, which is believed to have already been used in the conflict in Syria, a conflict where Russia has targeted civilian hospitals without mercy. Russian submarines have increased the tempo of their operations in recent years and have been frequent visitors to our home waters. And Russia's submersibles have also apparently spent considerable time reconnoitring the transatlantic cables which carry so much of our financial services business between Europe and the United States. In addition, last year a Russian surface task group included the aircraft carrier the Admiral Kuznetsov and the battlecruiser Peter the Great sailed through the English Channel en route to Syria. Russia is also upgrading its ground forces. The previous Vice Chief of the Defence Staff, General Sir Richard Barrons, reported that during the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, 2 Ukrainian mechanised infantry battalions were located by a Russian surveillance drone, and using rocket artillery, they were effectively destroyed in under 15 minutes. Russian long-range aviation maintains over 100 nuclear-capable strategic bombers, including the Bear Blackjack and Backfire aircraft. A new 5th-generation fighter, the Su-57, is due to enter service in around 2020, and Russian bomber aircraft now regularly encroach into our airspace and have to be regularly intercepted by our quick reaction alert Typhoons. All of this adds up to a considerable increase in the capability, both in nuclear and conventional forces, as part of a 10-year strategic armament programme running from 2011 through to 2020. According to the United States Defence Intelligence Agency, for much of that period, Russia spent around 3% of its GDP on defence, but it has increased to 4.5% of GDP last year. So in terms of their capability, the ability of Russia to inflict violence on us and our allies has increased considerably in recent years. Discerning Russian intentions is in many ways more difficult. But we can look at the actions of Russia over the past few years to try and give us some hints of what might lie in their minds in the future. And we can see very clearly that Russia has been prepared to use military power allied to information warfare to achieve its political ambitions on the European landmass. The invasion of Georgia in 2008, when I travelled to Georgia with David Cameron to support the Georgians, the annexation of the Crimea in 2014, effectively the invasion of the eastern Ukraine and the annexation, effectively, of some of those eastern provinces, and then the pressure put on the Baltic states, including a particularly virulent cyber attack on Estonia in 2007. In response to all of this, we certainly need to maintain and upgrade our nuclear deterrent, as approved by an overwhelming vote in this House several years ago. We also need to upgrade our conventional defences, as we did in the 1980s when faced with the threat of the Soviet Union, and bluntly, that means spending the money to do so. It's not often in this place that I agree with the member for Rhondda, but on this one, both he and I are right. The attack on Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia seems primarily to have been intended as a signal to other potential Russian defectors to think again. Nevertheless, this still represented a chemical weapons attack on British soil, seriously injuring a police officer and for whom some 30 other UK citizens required at least some medical attention. People who do this are not our friends. As long as Putin remains in government, it seems we have to accept the reality of entering into a cool war with Russia for the foreseeable future. However, working with our NATO allies, we successfully deterred the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and the wall came down. We may now have to do it again.
Carden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to speak in this debate. I'm from a generation that was born as the Cold War was ending. I'm also from a generation that does not want to see another begin. Let me be clear. It's an outrage that nerve agents have been used on the streets of a British city and in clear contravention of international law. It's appalling that people have been left fighting for their lives, including a policeman, Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey. And I'm sure the whole House will be relieved by the recent news that he's been discharged from hospital and has been able to return to his family. We're lucky that other members of the public who could have been killed or injured as well were not. If the evidence is clear and incontrovertible that the Russian state organised this attack, then the measures taken by the government are commensurate with what any government should do in such circumstances. We need to send a very clear message that banned nerve agents cannot be unleashed in this country or any other without robust consequences. Let me be clear, however, that the often hysterical, ill-informed and plain infantile attacks on my honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, for calling on the government to follow due diligence and, in particular, the guidelines set out by the Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons in such circumstances, has not only been disgraceful, but it's not helped our case in the court of international opinion. I do, however, notice that the government has quietly heeded his advice. Mr. Speaker, to call for due diligence makes absolute sense. My generation is old enough to remember the so-called dodgy dossier that was used to take us into what many believe an illegal war in Iraq. Politicising intelligence and turning it into propaganda is not the sort of activity that a democracy such as ours or any can ever be comfortable with. And my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, was right then, just as he was right on apartheid, on Chile, on Afghanistan and on Libya. And you'd think some members of this House, who've been far less prescient, would have learned to show a little more humility towards someone who has so often found himself on the right side of history. My question is today, what sort of future will Britain and indeed Europe have with Russia over the longer term? And if it is to be one of ever-growing suspicion and hostility, where could that lead to? And what sort of relationship does President Putin truly want with our country and with Germany, France and the other European countries that are so important for future trade, development and peace? I will.
I was sitting there thinking about what he says about due diligence and due process, and of course he's right. But President Putin presumes that we will do everything we can to ensure that there is proper process in this country, that there's a fair trial and all the rest of the thing, which would not be available to anybody in Russia. That's one of the things that we have to face here. And having gone through the whole Litvinenko process when I was a minister, the worst thing for Marina Litvinenko was that it was impossible to have a proper trial because the Russians simply wouldn't cooperate. Exactly. So we ended up very slowly ending up with a judicial review and inquiry, and we may end up having to do something exactly the same this time. But I just think we need to walk into this with our eyes very, very wide open.
Grateful to my honourable friend, and I don't think I disagree with anything that he says, and I think actually the role that the UK plays as a beacon of light and hope in terms of international law is just as important as any other role that it plays. At some point soon it will be important to have a grown-up debate beginning with some of Russia's closest neighbours who have the most to lose and gain from all of this, and at which point we may also ask the Defence Secretary, who told Vladimir Putin to shut up and go away, if he's matured enough to take part in that debate when the time comes. The policies that were being played out in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union ultimately failed and have helped contribute to where we are now. And Russia has seldom helped itself either, as those often close to the party... And Russia has seldom helped itself either. Unfortunately, even as those close to the party opposite were helping themselves to some of its oligarchs' rotten rubles, not least to help fund the Conservative Party. At some point, and at some point soon, we're all going to have to step back from the brink and reset relations with Russia. This House can take pride in the work that this country, along with others, has undertaken historically with the United Nations and others in destroying chemical and nerve weapon stocks and bringing about international agreements designed to ensure that they are never used again. The world has rightly been appalled when chemical weapons have been used against civilians in Syria, and why the world stands at one with Britain now over the use of nerve agents here. I
hope the honourable gentleman recognises what happened to America in their relationship with Russia when President Obama pressed the reset button, which is absolutely nothing. President Putin took it, he grabbed it, and he moved on with his own policies. And when the honourable gentleman talks about agreements to end chemical weapons and nerve weapons, we've heard it all before from Russia, and I would plead with him not to take at face value what the Russian state says.
And I certainly wouldn't disagree with him not to take things at face value, but I think as we look into the future, there will be a day when we seek, and when the political leader of this country and other European countries seek to press the reset button again, and whether President Putin is there when that happens, we'll see what kind of success we have then. But the message should be clear. We must bolster international law, working in cooperation with our international allies, put human rights at the heart of an ethical foreign policy, support and strengthen the United Nations, and use diplomacy to expand a progressive, rules-based international system. Rules which must apply to the strong as much as the weak. Thank you, Ma'am.
Alex Chaw.
Deputy Speaker, the barbaric attack in Salisbury marks a new low in relations between our nations. That's sad, but it's absolutely right. Chemical weapons are vile because of the appalling suffering they cause, but also their indiscriminate nature. Whoever planted this nerve agent knows fine well that whoever had come to the aid of those people suffering would likely have been very seriously injured. Those could have been completely innocent people, children going about their business. Now, it's a point that's been made already, but we should make it crystal clear our dispute is not with the Russian people. We mourn with them, those who have lost their lives in the shopping centre fire in Kemerovo. We acknowledge the courage and fortitude of the Russian people, particularly during what they refer to as the Great Patriotic War, in which over 20 million people died. And we pay tribute to what I think can fairly be referred to as the genius of the Russian people. This is the country that has produced Pushkin, Solzhenitsyn, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Chekhov, and so many others. We don't besmirch their reputation. Rather, our quarrel is with the Russian regime, a regime that has shown itself unwilling or incapable of complying with the international rule of law, and furthermore has demonstrated a worrying escalation in its behaviour. We know, of course, about Alexander Litvinenko. We know about the downing of MH17, which caused appalling loss of life, particularly amongst Dutch nationals. We know about the invasion of Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and plenty more besides. We've heard a little about cyber attacks in Estonia, and now we know highly likely responsible for this attack. But what characterises so much of this is what the Russians themselves refer to as maskirovka, or deception, political and military deception. In plain English, a worrying instinct to lie, to dissemble, to deceive, and to disguise. And so it was that the Russian defense minister himself described information as, quote, another type of armed forces. And so it is that a 3-year-old boy was said by Moscow TV to have been crucified in eastern Ukraine for speaking Russian. Well, it soon emerged that that was completely untrue, but it was an eloquent example and a ruthless example of the weaponization of information. Vladimir Putin himself, when a number of soldiers without insignia marched into Crimea, referred to in the West as little green men, he called them, quote, local self-defense units. It was tolerably plain that that was entirely false, not least because he then afterwards gave medals to Russian journalists who had clearly misrepresented the evidence in Crimea. And then, to make matters worse in our own example, we've heard that the statements that have come from the Russian embassy have been laced with sarcasm, scorn, and contempt. And most bizarrely of all, suggested that somehow the British could be involved. And it is that instinctive recourse to dishonesty which is so concerning. So how should we respond? Well, with cool heads and firm resolve. And I respectfully commend the Prime Minister for her sure-footed and calibrated response. The expulsion of 23 diplomats was absolutely right. But I would just say this, if I may. In responding to Russia, which does show this instinctive willingness to go beyond the international rule of law, we should not abandon our commitment to integrity and the rule of law. Instead, we should redouble our commitment to integrity and the rule of law. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that when we have in our sights individuals who may, we suggest, have been involved in money laundering, it's for an independent Serious Fraud Office or an independent Crown Prosecution Service to weigh the evidence and to consider fairly whether there is sufficient evidence to prosecute and whether it's in